Last August, the New York Times Magazine launched the 1619 Project in an attempt to reframe America's history through the lens of slavery. The name marks the arrival of the first enslaved people brought from Africa to the then Virginia colony. The sweeping project analyzed how slavery shaped American political, social, and economic institutions. Its authors sought to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. Demand for the issue was intense, with New Yorkers lining up on the street to obtain copies. It was one of the most read pieces of journalism produced by the Times that entire year. The project grew to include a special section in the paper, a live event series, podcasts, books, and even an ad that ran during the Academy Awards. But a backlash ensued. Princeton historian Sean Wilentz, generally considered to be a liberal, criticized its cynicism and began circulating a letter objecting to the project. Four leading scholars in their field, James McPherson, Gordon Wood, Victoria Bynum, and James Oakes, signed on, and the letter was sent to the New York Times, a version of which was published on December 4th. They wrote, "We are dismayed at some of the factual errors in the project and the closed process behind it. These errors, which concern major events, cannot be described as interpretation or framing. They are matters of verifiable fact, which are the foundation of both honest scholarship and honest journalism." They suggest a displacement of historical understanding by ideology, dismissal of objections on racial grounds, that they are the objections of only white historians, has affirmed that displacement. They labeled other material as misleading and asked the Times to issue prominent corrections of all the errors and distortions presented in the 1619 Project. The paper responded, writing in part, "We are familiar with the objections of the letter writers, as four of them have been interviewed in recent months by the World Socialist website. We disagree with their claim that our project contains significant factual errors and is driven by ideology rather than historical understanding. While we welcome criticism, we don't believe that the request for corrections to the 1619 Project is warranted." Then in February, a counter-project emerged. The 1776 Project was launched by Robert Woodson, a Black conservative and longtime community activist in Washington. Woodson said the project intended to counter what he called the anti-America propaganda of the Times endeavor. What's troubling about 1619 is that it defines America as being incurably racist, he said. It insists that all white people are beneficiaries of privilege and victimizers, and all blacks are victims. Woodson recruited a number of leading thought leaders, including Glenn Loury, Carol Swain, John McWhorter, Jason Hill, and Wilfred Riley to write essays that provide an aspirational and inspirational counter-narrative to the Times's. For instance, in an essay entitled, "We Cannot Allow 1619 to Dumb Down America in the Name of a Crusade," John McWhorter, an associate professor at Columbia University, writes, "The New York Times 1619 Project is founded on empirical sand. The fundamental claim that the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery simply does not correspond with the facts. Too conclusively, to the point, has dismissed as hair-splitting." So we leave it there, and we'll bring in our guests. Joining us for this conversation, we have the reporter for the New York Times Magazine, Nikole Hannah-Jones, joins us now. Also with us for this discussion, Professor of History at Northwestern University, Leslie M. Harris. She wrote an opinion piece for Politico outlining one part of the 1619 Project that she disagrees with. Also, we have with us Pulitzer Prize-winning news columnist Clarence Page. He contributed to that 1776 website with a piece arguing for an embrace of Black Patriotism Over Victimization. And professor at Princeton University, Eddie Clark Jr., rounds out this incredible panel.
You know, it's an important panel if Eddie is here. And first of all, let me just say, this has been, and we've been trying to book this now for 2 months. And this has been the singular most difficult panel to book, only because people on both sides didn't want to come on to talk about it. So we really appreciate you four coming here today and having this really important discussion. And Nicole, first of all, congratulations on the Pulitzer Prize. And secondly, thank you for starting a debate that I think is going to be going on for quite some time. How do you respond to your critics who suggest that this is more driven by ideology than historical facts?
Well, let me start by saying I think that intro kind of sums up where we are, which was there was a great deal of time spent on the detractors and almost no time in the intro spent on all of the historians who have stood behind the project. This project states explicitly the ideology. We are a journalistic organization, and we said that we were going to do a project that was looking at the legacy of slavery and placing slavery at the center of the narrative. And that's what we did. It's not that we were hiding anything. I find the backlash in some ways unsurprising and in some ways surprising. For instance, with respect to Mr. Page, when one suggests that the 1619 Project is a project about Black victimization and not patriotism, it makes me wonder if Mr. Page even read the project or if Mr. Page even read my essay, because my essay is about how Black people, despite undergoing chattel slavery, legal apartheid, lynching, racial terrorism, segregated schools, segregated housing, segregated military, believed fervently in the founding ideals and have fought generation after generation to make those ideals true, and in fact had a faith in a country that didn't treat us as citizens and expanded democracy for all Americans. I don't think that's victimization at all. As a matter of fact, I think it's probably one of the most patriotic pieces one could read.
Clarence Page is here, and he can answer your question. Clarence, thanks for being here, and how do you respond?
Well, thank you, Joe, very much. I want to say that, first of all, I've always said that history is for arguing. There's every aspect of history. People say history is written by the winners. That's also true. The fact is, I was delighted to see the New York Times make this big of a commitment, first of all, to history. And as you mentioned earlier, people were lining up to get copies of this. This tells me a lot about the hunger out there, not just limited to Black folks, the hunger for more of a complete picture of American history. But my word for my reaction to the series was disappointment. I was disappointed that it didn't go enough beyond victimization into our overcoming. We have always had a struggle in this country for Black freedom, Black liberation, and it cuts both ways. Nicole's quite right about the achievements that are chronicled in this account. But a lot more could be said about the achievements of Black and white folks working together. I think one of the biggest objections to this series was in her introduction, where she essentially says that slavery was, well, the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. That's why the colonies broke away. And that's a simplistic and very controversial view that needs some arguing, and it's being argued very much now, as well as those factual questions that Sean Wilentz referred to.
Nicole, how do you respond to that?
Well, I understand. One, let me just say, if you read what I say in the essay, I say that one of the reasons that colonists, and now we've clarified that some colonists decide to join the revolution, is to preserve slavery. And we certainly have documentation of colonists in Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia who were reluctant to join the revolution, who did so out of fears of what Britain might do around the issue of slavery. So, you can disagree or agree. I understand that that's a controversial claim, but it was a 40,000 word project, 10 essays, 25 pieces of fiction written in the piece, an entire special section. 5 to 6 historians helped write for the project. Dozens of historians fact checked for the project. So yes, history is about arguing. And I didn't just make that claim up out of thin air and sit down at my computer one day and say, let me just make up something about the American Revolution. Now, whether or not historians want to agree with that and some want to argue with that, that is the nature of historiography, and I'm fine with that. I think the personal nature of the criticism and the ongoing months-long effort to discredit the entire project is what's been a little bit surprising.
Yeah. So Eddie, you and I have talked a good bit about balancing the ideas of the founding, as far as talking about Madisonian democracy, the checks and balances that we hope keep Donald Trump in check in the coming months, and we're actually seeing it unfold today in the Flynn case, and the judiciary actually checking some of the worst instincts of the Justice Department. But how do we synthesize it all from slaveholders? And in fact, a majority of the early presidents were slaveholders. Is it possible for us to separate the abominable personal behavior that they exhibited at the time with some of the high ideas that we still refer to in checking people who would want to run over constitutional norms and constitutional guarantees that have actually gotten us to where we are today?
I think the question, Joe, that we would have to worry, or the point that we would have to worry, is your choice of the verb separate, right? We don't separate our sinfulness from the fact that we can, in fact, be virtuous, right? As for some of us who are Christian, right? We're deeply flawed. And part of understanding the human endeavor is to understand those contradictions that make us who we are. I think what Nicole and the folks did with the 1619 Project was initiate something that was very important. And that is that we have to, in some ways, tell a different story about who we are as Americans, right? To tell a story that brings into view our contradictions as well as our aspirations. We're not just simply the shining city on the hill. We're not just simply the Redeemer nation. We're a country that has been overdetermined by the ugliness, the brutality of slavery, the ugliness of what happened to Native Americans, the ugliness of Jim Crow, and how, in fact, we have tried in so many ways through a struggle from below to overcome that. In some ways, I'm thinking of the second chapter of Revelations, verse 5. We have to do our first works over. And that requires telling a broader story to account for who we are. America, Joe, is not a white nation. And we have to tell a story that reflects that fact.
We certainly do. And by the way, Elijah Cummings might call you a counterfeit Mississippi preacher. We love you. We love your preaching. So let's go to Northwestern University, Professor Leslie Harris. Leslie, you made headlines earlier this year when you talked about fact-checking the project, and then were concerned that a lot of your fact-checking items were ignored, which, of course, seems to be central to the controversy of where we are now. Talk about those concerns and talk about the project generally.
First, I want to say that the 1619 Project is rhetorically brilliant. It is historically brilliant. It does what the best historians want to do, which is to bring this history to the general public. I think that Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay is excellent, and it reflects what many African Americans experience in this country, that we are in a country that is full of ideals, that is full of possibility, and yet we have been locked out of it. And so my concern was that I knew that the critique would focus on the small errors, and that is exactly what happened, as I say in my essay. What I tried to do was show where I thought there was an error, and I had expressed that. And I knew that people would begin to read the essay if I put that out there like that. But the greater problem for me, and this was not Nicole's fault, this was the historical profession's fault, is that even as the historical profession began to address histories of slavery, there were people who continued to ignore the history of slavery and the history of African Americans and their contributions to democracy, to our country, to the wealth of this country, the ideas of this country. And the two critics that I focused on in particular, Gordon Wood and Sean Wilentz, were among the people who in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s had not taken seriously how slavery affected our founding. The fact that most of our founding fathers owned slaves or were connected to the slave trade, that this country was rooted in the wealth created by slave labor. That, to me, is the bigger problem. And I really wanted people to grapple with that, as Eddie has said and as Nicole has demonstrated. I couldn't agree more with Nicole that there is so much in the 1619 Project magazine that has been overlooked because of the narrow focus on what is almost one sentence in that opening essay. And that is really disappointing to me. It's disappointing to those in the historical profession, and I would say very few in the historical profession, who focused on the 1619 Project in that way. Most have taken it up as a serious intervention into our public history and something that we will continue to debate and discuss for many years from now.
You know, Nicole, there's been much written about Abraham Lincoln and the criticisms of Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, we all grow up and we learn about the Emancipation Proclamation. And, you know, the words Lincoln freed the slaves rolls off, at least used to roll off the tongues of all most students. But I recently I saw Frederick Douglass's. I heard Frederick Douglass's words read on the death of Abraham Lincoln, and he talked about how, from the eyes of a lot of black people, Abraham Lincoln was too cautious. Was a white person's slain hero, didn't go fast enough. But then Frederick Douglass went on to say, but for his time, historically, he was nothing short of a liberator. He did great things. And isn't that the balance that we're having to strike? Not just here, but as we look back to Abraham Lincoln's time, and also as we look back to the time of this nation's founding. How do we balance the time of Abraham Lincoln specifically? Was Abraham Lincoln a hero? Was he a liberator of the slaves? Or was he too cautious? Was he too fearful of the general population?
I mean, I'm not a historian. I am a journalist, but this is what I will say. What the project attempts to do is complicate the narrative. You know, my 10-year-old daughter asks me all the time, was this person good or was this person bad? And I tell her there's rarely people who are one or the other. That people are capable of holding contradictory views. They are capable of doing both amazing things and things that are really devastating. And Abraham Lincoln was a man. I think and he was a man of his time. So, you know, we have deified our founders. We have deified Abraham Lincoln. And I was not saying in this project that Abraham Lincoln did no good. Clearly he did. And clearly his views on Black Americans were evolving right before his death. That's one of the reasons he was assassinated. But we have to have a more complicated narrative because the narrative has been extremely harmful to Black Americans. We are told that we are responsible for the conditions we live in. We are told these stories of these great men who did really horrible things to us, and that means that our stories are invisible. We are part of the story, and that's all that this project was trying to do, was turn the lens a little bit to focus on something that is a story that has truly been marginalized, but that really is central. So, yes, I think that Abraham Lincoln was changing, and I think that Abraham Lincoln who started the Civil War, or not started the Civil War, but the Abraham Lincoln at the onset of the Civil War was a different Abraham Lincoln at the end, and that's what this project is trying to uncover, is that complexity.
And I love that. You're trying to add to a complexity. By the way, your daughter sounds like my young children. I hate those questions, right? Yeah. Good or bad? It's not that easy.
Things can be true.
But you know, Clarence, this is the thing, though. I think for a lot of us, I think the most fascinating thing about Abraham Lincoln for me is if you read, for instance, Sandberg's biography on Lincoln, you have Lincoln wringing his hands at the beginning of the war, saying, you know what? If preserving the Union requires slavery in the South, I'll do that. If preserving the Union means abolition of slavery all across the country, I will do that. I'm here to abolish, to preserve the Union. But through the war, and you always get a sense that Lincoln's riding this volatile wave, and people don't remember that in New York there were huge protests against the Civil War. Yep. But you saw Lincoln's movement through the war. Just violent. And then just like, LBJ was an out-and-out segregationist, yet what he did in 64, 65, nothing short of remarkable politically. So I guess they are complex, and how do we accept them as a whole, their entire legacy, as we teach our children going into the next generation? Whether Abraham Lincoln was a good man or a bad man, LBJ, James Madison, all of these people.
Well, Joe, thank you for calling on me for that question, because my newspaper endorsed Abraham Lincoln. And we also were the big abolitionist paper in town. I don't personally remember it, Joe, but that legacy was a very strong one. And Abraham Lincoln was, well, his main goal was to save the Union, as you referred to, and was ready to do anything in order to do that. It was Frederick Douglass was a very important figure in persuading Lincoln to stop at nothing short of the right to vote, the liberation of the slaves, etc. And that, in three really fascinating visits between the two of them, he really helped to persuade Lincoln to write that Emancipation Proclamation. But even so, that proclamation did not apply to the states that did not secede from the Union, because Lincoln didn't want Washington, D.C. to be surrounded by slave states, Maryland and Virginia. But, I didn't even hear about Frederick Douglass, Joe, until I was in college, because, and I had a wonderful school system back there in Middletown, Ohio. But the only black folks I learned about were Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. And Frederick Douglass was a great journalist and role model as well. And the relationship, to me, is emblematic of the way blacks and whites worked together in this country to end slavery.
So we have to continue this conversation, but we thank you for now. Reporter for the New York Times Magazine, Nikole Hannah-Jones, professor of history at Northwestern, Leslie Harris, professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude Jr., and Pulitzer Prize-winning news columnist Clarence Page. Thank you all.
And Nikole, congratulations again on the Pulitzer, and thank you so much for having this debate. And coming on and talking about this, and actually starting a much bigger debate that I think actually is going to allow us to debate this in the open, instead of having people, like all the people who were afraid to come on this show, afraid to speak up in college classes, afraid to speak up in high school classes, afraid to speak up on this really important topic. Thank you and congratulations.
That does it for us this morning. Stephanie Ruhle picks up the coverage.
Oh, by the way, I got to say this. Cory Booker, I've gone Instagram Live tonight at 6:15 with Cory Booker. I hope you will tune in. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.